The morning after Pearl Harbor brought celebrations throughout Tokyo's Imperial Navy headquarters, but one man sat removed from the jubilation, his expression carefully neutral, while colleagues congratulated themselves on what they believed marked the beginning of Japan's ascendancy. Isoroku Yamamoto watched officers toast their success through his window. Yet the admiral who had orchestrated the surprise attack felt something quite different than triumph coursing through him. Unlike most of his peers, Yamamoto possessed intimate knowledge of the nation they had just provoked into warfare, having spent considerable time walking American streets, touring manufacturing facilities, witnessing firsthand the staggering scope of productive capacity that most Japanese military planners understood only as abstract statistics on paper. Detroit's automobile assembly lines had left an indelible impression on Yamamoto during his time in the United States. He had observed workers producing vehicles at rates that seemed almost impossible, watched raw materials flow into vast factory complexes and emerge as finished products with mechanical efficiency. The Texas petroleum fields he visited stretched beyond the horizon in every direction, representing more extractive capacity in a single American state than his entire nation possessed. These experiences shaped his understanding in ways that reports and intelligence briefings could never quite capture for those who had never witnessed American industrial might personally. When Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoye had asked him months earlier about prospects for war against the United States, Yamamoto had delivered an assessment that proved prophetic in its precision. He could promise aggressive action and effective resistance for perhaps 6 months, he told the Prime Minister, but harboured absolutely no confidence whatsoever about outcomes should the conflict extend into its 2nd or 3rd year. Those words now echoed with terrible weight as staff officers celebrated what they imagined represented decisive victory. The tactical execution at Pearl Harbor had indeed been masterful by any measure. 8 American battleships rested on the harbour bottom or sat severely damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft had been destroyed on the ground, and Japanese losses had been remarkably light considering the operation's audacity. Yet Yamamoto understood what his celebrating colleagues apparently did not. The American aircraft carriers had escaped, continuing to operate somewhere in the Pacific as potent threats to Japanese naval supremacy. Far more significantly, the attack had accomplished something Japanese planners desperately hoped to avoid. A previously fractured American public, deeply divided about involvement in foreign conflicts, had been unified overnight behind total warfare. The mathematics supporting Japan's inevitable defeat already existed in industrial production figures, resource extraction rates, manufacturing capacity, and population statistics. Yamamoto had studied these numbers carefully, understood their implications thoroughly, and recognized that nothing his nation accomplished tactically could overcome the strategic realities those figures represented. What none of the celebrating officers comprehended that December morning was the magnitude of response their attack would trigger. The most devastating industrial mobilization in human history was about to commence, an awakening of productive capacity so overwhelming that even Japanese military planners who had studied American potential, who had examined intelligence estimates, who had calculated relative manufacturing capabilities, could not truly comprehend its real magnitude until experiencing its effects firsthand. Every assumption undergirding Japanese strategic planning was about to collapse under the weight of American industrial output. This was not merely about military defeat through superior tactics or fighting skill. American productive capacity would psychologically demolish every calculation, every hope, every strategic premise that Japanese high command relied upon when making the decision to initiate hostilities. The assumptions about American weakness, about American unwillingness to endure hardship, about the possibility of negotiated settlement after initial Japanese victories, all these carefully constructed rationalizations were about to be systematically destroyed by the simple reality of comparative industrial strength. The path toward catastrophe had been constructed gradually throughout the previous decade through a combination of ambition and profound miscalculation. Japanese territorial expansion during the 1930s reflected determination to create what planners called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, essentially a self-sufficient empire under Tokyo's control. The invasion of China, beginning in earnest during 1937, had bogged down into grinding warfare that consumed resources without producing decisive results. When France fell to German forces in 1940, Japan moved to occupy French Indochina, seizing territory while European colonial powers were preoccupied with their own survival. Each expansion brought Japan closer to conflict with Western powers, particularly the United States, which viewed Japanese aggression with increasing alarm and responded with escalating economic sanctions. Japanese strategic planners understood quite clearly the unfavorable discrepancy between their nation's industrial potential and America's productive capacity. This was not hidden information or intelligence failure. The numbers existed in published industrial statistics, trade figures, resource extraction data, and manufacturing output records. In 1937, Japan's industrial capacity represented approximately 5% of global manufacturing capability. This placed Japanese industrial strength roughly equivalent to France, about half the capacity of either Great Britain or the Soviet Union individually. The United States, by stark contrast, commanded nearly 42% of world industrial production, even while still recovering from Depression-era economic disruption. The disparity was not merely significant, but overwhelming. Even accounting for Depression impacts on American manufacturing, even considering Japanese recent industrial growth, even factoring in every possible advantage, American war-making potential exceeded Japanese capacity by factors of 7 to 10 times, depending on the specific category of production being measured. These statistics were not secret. Japanese planners had access to them, discussed them in strategic planning sessions, understood their implications for prolonged warfare. Yet institutional momentum, political pressures, and cultural factors drove decision-making toward gambling on conflict despite unfavorable odds. The gamble rested on specific strategic assumptions about how warfare would unfold. Japanese success depended entirely on ability to extend the strategic advantage gained through the Pearl Harbor surprise attack by achieving additional rapid victories across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The plan possessed a certain desperate elegance: strike the American Pacific Fleet at its Hawaiian base to achieve temporary naval supremacy, simultaneously seize resource-rich territories throughout Southeast Asia to gain the oil, rubber, tin, and rice that Japan's limited domestic resources could not provide. Then present the United States with a defensive perimeter so vast and so heavily fortified that the cost of reconquering these territories would exceed American willingness to pay in blood and treasure. Faced with protracted warfare across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean, forced to assault heavily defended island positions one after another, suffering casualties that would mount continuously without producing decisive results, American leadership would eventually seek negotiated settlement, recognizing Japan's conquests and establishing a new balance of power in Asia. Victory depended entirely on American unwillingness to endure sustained combat and heavy losses for objectives in the distant Pacific. The Japanese High Command fundamentally misunderstood American national character, industrial capacity, and resolve. They projected their own resource limitations onto an enemy operating under entirely different economic realities. Where Japan saw warfare as ultimately determined by fighting spirit and willingness to sacrifice, America approached military conflict as an industrial problem to be solved through superior production and overwhelming material advantage. Yamamoto grasped these realities better than most of his colleagues precisely because he had experienced American society directly rather than relying on reports and statistics. He had traveled extensively across the United States, observed not just military installations but civilian infrastructure that revealed the true depth of American productive capacity. Oil derricks in Texas numbered in the thousands, each one producing more petroleum than entire Japanese oil fields. Agricultural abundance on American farms exceeded anything comparable in resource-poor Japan. The casual plenty of American civilian life, the vast automotive infrastructure, the continental scope of roads and railways and electrical grids, All of this demonstrated productive capacity that Japan simply could not match, regardless of fighting spirit or tactical skill. Before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had opposed initiating war with America precisely because he understood what such a conflict would ultimately entail. Anyone who has walked through Detroit's automobile factories, he had written, anyone who has witnessed Texas oil production understands immediately that Japan lacks the fundamental industrial strength for sustained competition with American productive capacity. This opposition to war had made him politically vulnerable within Japanese military circles, where army officers dominated strategic planning and viewed naval officers with institutional suspicion. Hardline militarist factions within the army considered Yamamoto's warnings about American strength as defeatism bordering on treason. His transfer to command the combined fleet served partly as protection from potential assassination by these extremist elements who had murdered other moderate voices in Japanese politics and military leadership. Given the task of planning warfare against a nation he believed Japan could not defeat, Yamamoto designed the Pearl Harbor operation with the hope of achieving the quick, decisive victory that represented Japan's only realistic chance for favorable outcomes. But hope was never strategy, and Yamamoto's private doubts never translated into sufficient warning for civilian government leaders who ultimately made the decision for war. The political dynamics within Japan's government had shifted power increasingly toward army officers who favored aggressive expansion and dismissed concerns about American industrial capacity as overblown or irrelevant compared to Japanese fighting spirit. The first 6 months following Pearl Harbor seemed to validate Japanese strategic assumptions through a series of stunning victories that exceeded even optimistic projections. The speed and scope of territorial conquest was breathtaking by any historical measure. Within mere days of the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese forces struck American, British, and Dutch possessions throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia in coordinated operations. The Philippines fell after fierce resistance by American and Filipino forces. Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong succumbed to Japanese assault. Malaya and Singapore, the latter considered an impregnable British fortress, collapsed with shocking rapidity. The Dutch East Indies, with its precious oil resources, came under Japanese control. Burma was conquered, cutting supply routes to China. By March 1942, Japan controlled a vast empire stretching from the Chinese interior to the Central Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands near Alaska to the approaches of Australia. The defensive perimeter that Japanese strategy required was established far more easily than planners had dared hope. Raw materials began flowing toward Japanese industry. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, tin from throughout the region, rice from Burma and Indochina. All the resources Japan had gone to war to secure now moved under Japanese control. The war appeared to be proceeding exactly according to strategic planning. Allied resistance had crumbled faster than anticipated. Japanese casualties had been remarkably light. Territory had been seized that would require years for any counter-offensive to reconquer. These victories created dangerous overconfidence among Japanese military leaders who began to believe that American industrial capacity had been overstated, that Western powers lacked the will to fight effectively in the Pacific, that Japan's defensive perimeter was essentially impregnable. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo started planning even more ambitious operations during this period of triumph, convinced that momentum favored continued expansion. Some officers proposed invading Australia, others advocated for operations against India to link up with German forces presumably advancing through the Middle East. The ease of conquest, the weakness of Allied resistance, the apparent vindication of Japanese tactical superiority over material advantage, all of this encouraged thinking that the war was essentially won and only the details of final settlement remained to be negotiated. Yet even during this period of unbroken triumph, warning signs appeared for those willing to see them. The Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942, though tactically insignificant in terms of physical damage inflicted, demonstrated American determination and capabilities that should have deeply concerned Tokyo planners. 16 B-25 bombers, medium-range aircraft never designed for carrier operations, launched from the aircraft carrier Hornet approximately 150 miles from Japan and struck Tokyo, Yokohama, and other cities. The damage was indeed minimal, a few buildings destroyed, some casualties, nothing that affected Japan's war-making capacity. But the psychological impact reverberated throughout Japanese military and civilian leadership. The sacred homeland had been violated. Japanese territory had been bombed. The population had been placed at risk. Air defenses had failed to prevent the attack. The raid exposed Japanese vulnerability in ways that statistics about American production could not. If American forces could strike Tokyo itself barely 4 months after Pearl Harbor, what did this suggest about American determination and capability? The Japanese High Command's response to the Doolittle raid revealed the psychological impact. Rather than dismissing it as an insignificant pinprick, rather than recognizing it as a morale operation with no strategic value, Japanese planners decided to extend the defensive perimeter further eastward to prevent similar attacks in the future. This decision led directly to the operation against Midway Atoll, which would prove catastrophic for Japanese naval power. The Battle of the Coral Sea in early May 1942 provided another warning that should have prompted reassessment of strategic assumptions. Though tactically inconclusive, with both sides losing carriers and claiming victory, the strategic outcome clearly favored American interests. Japan's planned invasion of Port Moresby was abandoned. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese expansion had been checked. The battle demonstrated that American forces, even when outnumbered, even when operating at the extreme end of supply lines, could fight the Imperial Japanese Navy to a standstill. American damage control proved superior, American intelligence was clearly reading Japanese communications to some degree, and American willingness to accept combat rather than withdrawing in face of superior forces suggested that assumptions about American fighting spirit might require revision. Then came Midway, the battle that shattered Japanese naval supremacy and exposed fatal flaws in strategic calculations with brutal clarity. Yamamoto had designed the Midway operation to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. The attack would capture Midway Atoll itself, extending the defensive perimeter further east. More importantly, the operation would lure the remaining American carriers into decisive battle, where superior Japanese numbers and tactical skill would destroy American naval aviation, leaving the Pacific open for further Japanese operations. Japanese intelligence estimates placed American carrier strength in the Pacific at 2 vessels. The carrier Yorktown, damaged during Coral Sea operations, was assessed as out of action for months. In reality, American shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor had performed near-miraculous repairs, returning Yorktown to combat readiness in just 72 hours through round-the-clock emergency work. 3 American carriers would face 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, narrowing the numerical advantage Japanese planners had assumed they would enjoy. More critically, American codebreakers had achieved remarkable success against Japanese naval communications. Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had broken enough of the Japanese naval code designated JN-25 to determine that the target of Japan's planned operation, referred to in intercepted messages as AF, was Midway Atoll. To confirm this assessment and eliminate any possibility of error, American intelligence had Midway send a false message in plain text reporting fresh water shortages. Japanese radio traffic soon mentioned that AF was experiencing water supply problems. The trap was set with complete knowledge of Japanese intentions, timing, and force composition. American carriers moved into position north of Midway, waiting in ambush for the Japanese fleet that had no idea it was sailing into prepared defenses. The battle itself unfolded with devastating speed on the morning of June 4th. Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu launched strikes against Midway Island facilities, while American carriers maneuvered to attack position. American torpedo bomber squadrons from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown attacked the Japanese fleet in waves. The torpedo attacks were slaughtered with horrific losses. 41 of 41 Devastator torpedo bombers were shot down, killed by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire without scoring a single hit. The sacrifice was not in vain tactically, even though the air crews died without achieving their objective. The torpedo attacks drew Japanese fighters to low altitude, scattered the combat air patrol, and left the sky clear at higher altitudes just as American dive bombers arrived above the Japanese carriers. At approximately 10:22 in the morning, Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived simultaneously above the Japanese carriers in what American pilots would later describe as perfect timing, born of luck and sacrifice. Within 5 minutes that would determine the Pacific War's trajectory, 3 Japanese carriers were mortally wounded. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were struck by bombs while their decks were crowded with fueled and armed aircraft being prepared for strikes against the American carriers. The resulting fires were catastrophic, beyond any possibility of control. Fueled aircraft exploded, ordnance detonated, aviation gasoline spread flames throughout the ships. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, survived this initial strike temporarily and launched counterattacks that crippled Yorktown with bomb and torpedo hits. But by evening, American dive bombers found Hiryu and left her fatally damaged as well. By June 7th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers had sunk along with the cruiser Mikuma. Japan lost 3,100 men, 248 aircraft, and critically, approximately 100 of their most experienced pilots, along with hundreds of irreplaceable aviation mechanics and technicians who possessed skills that took years to develop. American losses were lighter in comparison, though still significant. 1 carrier, Yorktown, was sunk, the destroyer Hammond went down, 150 aircraft were lost, and 307 men died. The immediate tactical impact was clear enough. Japan had lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific and would never regain it. But the deeper significance took longer to manifest and ultimately proved more devastating than the immediate battle damage. Midway exposed fundamental weaknesses in Japanese planning, training, industrial capacity, and strategic thinking that would prove terminal over the following 3 years of warfare. Japan entered the war with 6 large fleet carriers and 5 smaller ones, providing the core of naval striking power that had dominated the Pacific during the first 6 months of conflict. America had begun the war with 3 large carriers in the Pacific theater. The critical question was not the starting balance, but replacement capacity. How quickly could each nation replace combat losses? The answer to this question would devastate Japanese strategic planning and psychological assumptions about the war's trajectory. American industrial mobilization during World War II represented the greatest sustained economic effort in human history, transforming an economy still recovering from depression into the arsenal of democracy that would supply not just American forces, but allied nations across the globe. President Franklin Roosevelt, speaking to Congress less than 1 month after Pearl Harbor, laid out production goals that seemed fantastic even to his own economic advisors and industrial planners. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, increasing to 125,000 in 1943. 120,000 tanks across the same period. 55,000 anti-aircraft guns. These targets seemed impossible to achieve given existing production capacity. They were met and exceeded as American industry transitioned to wartime production with remarkable speed and efficiency. The statistics compiled as production ramped up were genuinely staggering. In the 3 years following Midway, Japanese shipyards managed to construct 6 aircraft carriers total. In the identical time period, American shipyards delivered 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls, and dozens of escort carriers for anti-submarine and support operations. The Essex-class carriers themselves represented an industrial achievement that Japanese planners could barely comprehend, even when confronted with evidence of their existence. The United States Navy initially ordered 32 Essex-class carriers as part of wartime expansion. Though not all were completed before war's end, 24 were actually built and 14 saw combat service during World War II. Each displaced approximately 30,000 tons, measured 870 feet in length, and carried more than 90 aircraft. At peak production efficiency, American shipyards were launching one Essex-class carrier approximately every 6 weeks, an achievement that seemed impossible by pre-war industrial standards. In 1944 alone, American factories produced more aircraft than Japan manufactured during the entire war period from 1944 to 1945, 39 through 1945. America produced approximately 297,000 aircraft during the war years. Japan managed approximately 76,000. American shipyards delivered more tonnage in the first 4.5 months of 1943 than Japan launched across 7 years of wartime production. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, converted from automobile production to bomber manufacturing, produced one B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 63 minutes at peak production rates. This single factory complex outproduced entire Japanese aircraft industries. The numerical advantages extended across every category of military production without exception. American factories built 86,000 tanks compared to Japan's approximately 2,000 medium and heavy tanks. America produced 2 million trucks for military logistics. Japan managed approximately 165,000. In artillery pieces, small arms, ammunition, and every other category of war material, American production exceeded Japanese output by factors ranging from 5 to 20 depending on the specific item. Japanese military planners received intelligence reports detailing much of this information through various sources, including neutral country observations, captured documents, and simple analysis of equipment appearing in combat. Yet the numbers created cognitive dissonance that prevented proper strategic adjustment. The production figures were so overwhelming that accepting them as accurate meant accepting inevitable defeat. Japanese commanders chose instead to hope that numbers were exaggerated, that American equipment quality would prove inferior despite impressive quantities, that somehow Japanese fighting spirit and tactical superiority could overcome material disadvantage, that the tide could yet be turned through brilliant operations and willingness to sacrifice. Admiral Yamamoto never suffered these particular delusions about American weakness. His understanding of American power only deepened as the war progressed and evidence accumulated of industrial mobilization proceeding exactly as he had feared. Historians continue debating whether Yamamoto actually spoke the famous words attributed to him immediately after Pearl Harbor about awakening a sleeping giant and filling him with terrible resolve. No contemporaneous written record of this exact quotation exists in Japanese documents. The line appeared first in the 1970 film Tora, 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 written by screenwriters dramatizing events. But whether Yamamoto spoke those precise words or something similar, the sentiment accurately reflected his documented views expressed in letters and conversations. What Yamamoto definitely did write in a letter dated January 9, 1942, was this assessment of Pearl Harbor's significance. A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame for the one smitten. He understood that defeating an unprepared enemy proved absolutely nothing about relative strength between nations. The true test would come when America fully mobilized industrial might and brought that capacity to bear in sustained warfare. That mobilization gathered momentum throughout 1942 and reached full productive force by 1943, transforming American military capabilities with stunning rapidity. The industrial statistics translated into operational reality across every Pacific battlefield where American and Japanese forces engaged. At Guadalcanal, from August 1942 through February 1943, American forces demonstrated their ability to sustain major combat operations across vast oceanic distances while maintaining supply lines and replacing losses. The campaign became a grinding attritional struggle lasting 6 months, exactly the kind of sustained operation that exposed Japanese vulnerabilities most clearly. Japan had planned for quick, decisive battles where superior fighting spirit and tactical skill would overcome material disadvantage. The Guadalcanal campaign required sustained operations draining resources continuously, replacing casualties constantly, maintaining supply lines under attack, reinforcing positions repeatedly. The Japanese merchant fleet, absolutely essential for supplying far-flung garrisons and transporting resources back to home islands for industrial use, steadily eroded under relentless American submarine attack. Japanese anti-submarine warfare proved inadequate throughout the conflict. Merchant ship construction never matched losses. In 1943, American submarines sank more Japanese merchant tonnage than Japanese shipyards could launch. By 1944, Japan's merchant marine was in terminal decline, unable to supply captured territories adequately or transport resources from those territories back to Japan. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, the critical resource Japan had literally gone to war to secure, increasingly remained undelivered as tankers fell victim to American torpedoes in growing numbers. Japanese aircraft production illustrated similar patterns of inadequate response to American industrial mobilization. While American factories churned out newer and better aircraft designs in massive quantities, Japanese production stagnated in both numbers and technological advancement. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, genuinely brilliant when introduced in 1940, remained in frontline service throughout the entire war with only minor modifications because resources and industrial capacity prevented development and mass production of superior replacement designs. American fighter development progressed rapidly from the adequate F-4F Wildcat through the superior F-6F Hellcat to the exceptional F-4U Corsair, each iteration representing substantial performance improvements over its predecessor. By 1943, American fighters were demonstrably superior to Japanese designs in speed, armament, durability, and pilot protection. They appeared in combat in numbers that completely overwhelmed Japanese air units, regardless of pilot skill. The pilot training differential compounded these technological and numerical advantages significantly. America's vast educational infrastructure supported massive pilot training programs producing thousands of qualified aviators continuously. Aviation cadets received thorough instruction in multi-engine aircraft, navigation, tactics, gunnery, and emergency procedures. Completion rates remained high throughout the war. The pipeline of new pilots grew steadily rather than contracting. Japanese training programs, increasingly resource-constrained and casualties depleted, shortened training periods repeatedly and reduced standards to get pilots into combat faster. By 1944, Japanese pilots entered combat with a fraction of the flight hours their American counterparts accumulated during training. The results were entirely predictable. Superior American aircraft flown by better-trained pilots produced kill ratios that made Japanese aircrew losses utterly unsustainable. Yet even as evidence of American industrial supremacy mounted battle after battle, many Japanese commanders clung to hope grounded in cultural concepts about fighting spirit overcoming material advantage. The traditional idea of Yamamoto Damashi, the spirit of old Japan, suggested that superior morale and fighting determination could overcome material disadvantages. Bushido traditions emphasized honor, sacrifice, and death before surrender as core warrior virtues. These cultural factors, while producing individual acts of remarkable courage and determination, prevented realistic strategic reassessment. Officers who suggested that the war was lost faced accusations of defeatism. Proposals for negotiated settlement were dismissed as dishonor. The institutional momentum toward continued resistance, regardless of circumstances, became unstoppable even as defeat became mathematically certain. The fall of the Mariana Islands during summer 1944 marked the moment when even the most optimistic Japanese commanders could no longer maintain illusions about the war's ultimate trajectory. The invasion of Saipan began on June 15, 1944, with American forces supported by overwhelming naval gunfire and abundant supplies. Japanese defenders fought with their characteristic determination and ferocity. The combat was savage, with Japanese soldiers and civilians choosing death over capture in horrifying numbers. but the outcome was never seriously in doubt once American forces established their beachhead. Superior firepower, unlimited ammunition, continuous air support, and steady reinforcement of fresh troops ground down Japanese resistance systematically. Saipan fell on July 9th. Tinian followed by August 1st. Guam was secured by August 10th. The strategic implications were catastrophic for Japan's defensive strategy. The Marianas placed American B-29 superfortress bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The carefully constructed defensive perimeter that was supposed to make reconquest prohibitively expensive had been penetrated at its most critical point. Japan itself now faced direct strategic bombing from bases that American forces could supply and defend easily. The loss signaled that Japan could no longer prevent American advances anywhere. The overwhelming superiority in ships, aircraft, supplies, trained personnel, and industrial support meant that American forces could strike any target they chose and prevail through sheer material advantage regardless of Japanese tactical skill or fighting determination. Prime Minister General Hideki Tojo, who had pushed Japan into war and led the government through the period of expansion and early victories, received blame for the Marianas disaster. He was forced to resign on July 18, 1944, having lost political support among civilian leaders and even some military officers who finally recognized the war was lost. His successor, General Kuniaki Koiso, inherited an impossible situation. The war was effectively decided, American victory was mathematically certain, yet surrender remained politically unthinkable and militarily unacceptable to the army officers who still dominated government decision-making. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought on June 19th through 20th concurrent with the Marianas invasion, provided yet another devastating demonstration of American material supremacy. Japanese naval aviation, attempting to attack American carriers supporting the invasion, was slaughtered in what American pilots gleefully called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days of air combat, Japan lost approximately 480 aircraft and 3 carriers, including the newest carrier Taiho, which had just been commissioned. American losses were comparatively trivial. Japanese naval aviation, already severely weakened by years of attrition and inadequate pilot training, never recovered from this catastrophic defeat. The skilled pilots who died could not be replaced with equally trained replacements. The aircraft shot down exceeded production capacity to replace them. American commanders by this point understood completely that they held overwhelming advantages in every category that mattered for modern warfare. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific Fleet operations, and General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Southwest Pacific Forces, conducted operations with confidence born of material abundance. When planning required additional carriers, they appeared from American shipyards. When operations needed more aircraft, factories delivered them. When campaigns required ammunition, supplies arrived in quantities that seemed unlimited. The contrast with Japanese operations could not have been more stark. The Philippines campaign from October 1944 through July 1945 exemplified this disparity in resources and sustainability. American forces landed on Leyte on October 20, 1944, supported by the largest naval armada yet assembled in the Pacific. The Japanese Navy, recognizing this as potentially the decisive battle, committed virtually all remaining strength to destroying the invasion fleet. The resulting series of engagements, called the Battle of Leyte Gulf, became the largest naval battle in history, measured by tonnage of ships engaged. American carrier aircraft sank the massive battleship Musashi, sister ship to Yamamoto and pride of the Japanese Navy. In Surigao Strait, American battleships and destroyers destroyed a Japanese southern force in the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history. Off Samar, a Japanese center force encountered American escort carriers in confused action, where Japanese command failures and aggressive American destroyer attacks prevented complete disaster. Finally, off Cape Engano, American carriers destroyed the last remnants of Japanese carrier aviation being used as decoy force. By October 26th, Japanese naval power had effectively ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and thousands of trained seamen who represented years of training investment. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again sortie in fleet strength for major operations. The strategic bombing of Japan, which intensified throughout 1944 and 1945, brought home the war's industrial implications to Japanese civilians and leaders alike with devastating directness. B-29 superfortresses flying from Marianas bases struck Japanese cities with increasing frequency and severity as American air forces refined tactics and built up strength. The bombing campaign evolved from precision strikes against specific industrial targets to area bombing designed to destroy Japan's urban manufacturing centers, where small workshops and home industries produced substantial portions of war material. Operation Meeting House, the firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th through 10th, 1945, represented the destructive peak of the strategic bombing campaign. 334 B-29 bombers dropped approximately 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo's densely packed residential and industrial districts. The resulting firestorm killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night, destroyed 16 square miles of urban area, and left more than 1 million people homeless. It was the single most destructive air raid in human history up to that point, more deadly than either of the atomic bombings that would follow months later. The toll on Japanese cities became staggering as the campaign continued relentlessly. 66 additional cities suffered similar incendiary attacks. By war's end, approximately 350,000 to 500,000 Japanese civilians had died in strategic bombing campaigns. Major industrial cities were reduced to ash and rubble. Manufacturing capacity was crippled. Transportation networks were destroyed. Yet even this unprecedented destruction failed to break Japanese government's will to continue resistance. The military government, dominated by army officers committed to fighting literally to national extinction, refused to consider surrender under any circumstances. Emperor Hirohito, who traditionally remained above political and military decisions according to constitutional practice, became increasingly concerned as the true situation became undeniably clear through briefings on war progress. The emperor understood by early 1945 that Japan faced certain defeat. Yet constitutional position and political strength of army hardliners prevented him from directly ordering surrender without precipitating possible coup attempt by fanatical officers. Japan's government was completely paralyzed between the reality of certain defeat and the cultural impossibility of accepting that defeat honorably. The Soviet Union's entry into war against Japan on August 8, 1945, shattered Japan's last desperate diplomatic hope for avoiding unconditional surrender. Japanese leaders had attempted to use Soviet neutrality as potential avenue toward negotiated settlement. The Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, signed in April 1941, had allowed both nations to focus military resources elsewhere, the Soviets against Germany and Japan against Western powers. Japanese diplomats hoped desperately that Stalin might mediate between Japan and Western allies, perhaps securing terms short of the unconditional surrender that America demanded. This hope was completely delusional. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin had promised Western allies that the Soviet Union would enter war against Japan within 90 days of victory in Europe. The German government surrendered on May 8, 1945. On August 8, exactly 90 days later as promised, the Soviet Union declared war against Japan. Soviet forces invaded Manchuria with overwhelming strength, crushing Japanese armies that had been stripped of resources and effective units to defend home islands. In 1 week of operations, Soviet forces overran Japanese defensive positions that had taken years to construct. The Kwantung Army, once Japan's most formidable military formation, disintegrated completely under Soviet mechanized assault. The Soviet invasion meant Japan now faced enemies on all fronts with absolutely no prospect of diplomatic escape or negotiated settlement. Yet even this catastrophe did not immediately produce surrender from Tokyo government. The Japanese military leadership, particularly army officers, actually proposed continuing the war through essentially national suicide, inflicting such horrific casualties on expected American invasion forces that favorable peace terms might still somehow be secured. This delusional fantasy persisted even after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, killing approximately 130,000 people initially, with tens of thousands more dying later from radiation effects. Within Japan's military government, army hardliners continued arguing that surrender remained dishonorable and that fight to extinction represented the only acceptable course. Only Emperor Hirohito's personal intervention, breaking completely with constitutional precedent and risking potential military coup, finally forced Japan's capitulation. On August 15, 1945, the Emperor's recorded voice broadcast surrender announcement to the Japanese people. It was the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard their emperor speak. His words carefully avoided the actual term surrender, instead announcing that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, a masterpiece of diplomatic understatement. The announcement stunned a population that had been told consistently through government propaganda that Japan was winning and that final victory remained achievable through sufficient sacrifice and determination. The reality of complete defeat, suddenly acknowledged officially, shattered the propaganda that had sustained Japanese civilian morale through years of increasing hardship. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for Allied powers, oversaw Japan's occupation and reconstruction following surrender. The occupation exposed Japanese people directly to American material abundance and organizational efficiency in ways that transformed understanding of relative national capabilities. American soldiers arrived with equipment, supplies, and resources that Japanese civilians had never imagined existed in such quantities. For Japanese military leaders facing post-war interrogation and war crimes trials, the process forced painful acknowledgement of their catastrophic failures in understanding American industrial capacity and national determination. Former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, on trial for war crimes before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, was forced to admit publicly that Japan had fundamentally underestimated American potential. "We did not adequately comprehend American productive capacity," he testified, representing an extraordinary admission from the man who had led Japan into war. Post-war interrogations of surviving Japanese military personnel revealed systematic failures in strategic assessment that extended far beyond simple miscalculation of production statistics. Japanese planners had completely failed to understand American ability to project military power across vast oceanic distances while maintaining adequate supply for sustained operations. They had drastically underestimated American technological innovation and ability to develop superior weapons systems continuously. Most critically, they had failed to comprehend that American military doctrine fundamentally emphasized material advantage rather than warrior spirit as the foundation of victory. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier striking force at both Pearl Harbor and Midway, died by suicide during the Battle of Saipan in July 1944 rather than face capture. His surviving staff officers testified about Japanese planning assumptions and acknowledged that intelligence services had actually provided accurate information about American industrial production capabilities. The failure was not intelligence gathering but strategic assessment and willingness to accept intelligence implications. Japanese commanders had known the production numbers but refused to accept what those numbers meant for war's ultimate outcome. Post-war analysis conducted by both Japanese and American military historians confirmed that Japan had gambled everything on a short war because Japanese leaders understood they absolutely could not win a prolonged conflict. But the gamble rested on assumptions about American psychology and national character that proved completely wrong. Japanese planners believed Americans were soft, decadent, internally divided, and fundamentally unwilling to endure sustained hardship for distant objectives. Pearl Harbor would shock them into accepting Japanese hegemony in Asia rather than fighting a long, costly war. Instead, Pearl Harbor accomplished the exact opposite, unifying American society completely behind total war and transforming American industrial might from theoretical potential into kinetic reality. Roosevelt's production goals, which had seemed fantastic and probably unachievable in December 1941, were not only met but substantially exceeded because American industry, labor, and agriculture fully mobilized with remarkable efficiency. Women entered factories in massive numbers, replacing men sent to military service and expanding total workforce simultaneously. Agricultural productivity increased dramatically through mechanization and improved techniques. Raw material extraction expanded across every category. The American economy grew at approximately 15% annually throughout the war years, while simultaneously supporting massive military production, maintaining civilian consumption at reasonable levels, and providing enormous aid to allied nations through Lend-Lease programs. The contrast with Japan's economic performance was absolutely stark. Japan's economy, far smaller initially, faced crippling constraints that worsened continuously. American submarine warfare devastated merchant shipping, cutting off resources from conquered territories. Strategic bombing destroyed urban manufacturing capacity. Naval blockade reduced industrial output through raw material shortages that became increasingly severe. By 1945, Japanese aircraft production had declined to approximately 150 aircraft monthly. American production exceeded 8,000 aircraft per month, more than 50 times Japanese output. Japanese soldiers in the field faced ammunition shortages that limited training and combat effectiveness. American forces had ammunition in such abundance they could waste it without concern. Japanese civilians were literally starving by war's end. American soldiers were fed so well that their rations seemed like luxury to anyone from resource-deprived nations. Several former Japanese officers who survived the war offered frank assessments of strategic failures in memoirs and interviews conducted decades later after time had provided perspective. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who served as last commander of the combined fleet, wrote in his 1950 memoirs that Japan had fought a war it could not possibly win from the very beginning. We understood American material superiority intellectually through statistics and reports, but we did not grasp its implications emotionally or strategically. We believed fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. This was our fundamental and fatal error. Mitsumasa Yonai, who served as both Prime Minister and Navy Minister at various times, told American interrogators in 1945 that Japanese naval officers had repeatedly warned civilian government leaders that war with America was completely unwinnable based on industrial capacity comparisons. These warnings were systematically ignored by army leaders who controlled government policy and dismissed concerns about American strength as defeatist thinking. Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading surviving fighter ace with 64 confirmed victories, wrote extensively after the war about declining quality of Japanese pilots and aircraft as the conflict progressed. In his autobiography, Samurai, published in 1957, Sakai described watching newly trained pilots deployed to combat with minimal flight hours. They were simply slaughtered, he wrote. They never had any real chance of survival. By 1944, we veteran pilots understood completely that we were losing. We could observe the quality of American aircraft improving continuously, while ours remained stagnant. We could see numbers of American planes increasing while ours declined. But we kept fighting because we had no alternative and because duty demanded it. The industrial statistics documenting Japan's defeat were compiled systematically after the war by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which conducted detailed analysis of both strategic bombing effectiveness and comparative industrial production. The final accounting was stark and undeniable. America produced approximately two-thirds of all Allied military equipment during the war, despite Britain and Soviet Union also maintaining substantial production. American factories built more than 5,000 ships of all types. American shipyards replaced all Allied shipping sunk by Axis submarine warfare and then built additional capacity beyond pre-war tonnage levels. Japanese production, by comparison, had proven utterly inadequate to sustain modern warfare. Japan built 6 carriers total after Midway. America built 122 carriers of all types, including fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers. Japan produced 76,000 aircraft total, across all types throughout the entire war. America produced nearly 300,000 aircraft. Japan built approximately 165,000 trucks. America built 2 million military trucks. In steel production, oil refining, aluminum fabrication, electronics manufacturing, and every other category of industrial output measured, American production exceeded Japanese capacity by factors of 10 to 20 depending on specific category. The human cost of Japan's strategic miscalculation was absolutely staggering by any measure. Approximately 2.8 million Japanese military personnel died during the war. Between 500,000 and 1 million Japanese civilians died from bombing, starvation, disease, and other war-related causes. These casualties occurred in a war that Japanese leaders themselves initiated, while understanding at some level that it was probably unwinnable but gambling that American unwillingness to fight would make victory possible despite unfavorable material balance. For individuals within Japanese high command, the moment of true realization about American power came at different times for different officers. Some, like Yamamoto, understood from the very beginning and opposed war for precisely that reason. Others maintained delusions until Saipan fell in summer 1944. Still others clung to hope until Leyte Gulf destroyed naval power. A few maintained illusions, even through the atomic bombings. But eventually, every surviving Japanese military leader confronted the same inescapable truth. Japan had attacked a nation with 10 times its industrial capacity, unified that nation's previously divided population behind total war, and then discovered that no amount of tactical brilliance or fighting spirit could overcome the resulting material tsunami. In decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and eventually became the world's second-largest economy by the 1980s, the lessons of 1941 through 1945 profoundly shaped Japanese thinking about power, prosperity, and international relations. Modern Japan achieved far greater success and genuine prosperity through peaceful trade and industrial development than it ever gained through military conquest and empire building. The industrial capacity that Japanese leaders in the 1930s sought desperately to seize through military force was ultimately developed far more successfully through peaceful economic enterprise, international trade, and technological innovation. The story of Japan's high command finally confronting the reality of American power serves ultimately as a cautionary tale about the profound dangers of strategic self-deception. Information was available throughout the process. Warnings were given by knowledgeable officers like Yamamoto. Evidence accumulated continuously from the moment war began. Yet institutional momentum, cultural biases emphasizing fighting spirit over material reality, and political constraints preventing honest assessment all combined to prevent rational strategic reassessment until defeat became absolutely undeniable. For individual Japanese officers scattered across Pacific battlefields and home islands, the realization came through various experiences at different moments. Some witnessed it in the endless avalanche of American aircraft filling the skies. Others saw it in the unlimited supplies supporting every American advance. Some understood when their own starving forces watched American prisoners eating abundantly. Others comprehended only when B-29 bombers turned their cities to ash night after night. America's industrial capacity was not propaganda designed to intimidate enemies. It was not exaggeration intended to boost morale. It was simple material reality that determined the war's outcome as surely as if final battles had already been fought mathematically in December 1941. The Japanese High Command had indeed awakened a sleeping giant exactly as Yamamoto feared, and that giant possessed productive power that Japan had absolutely no capacity to resist once fully mobilized. The mathematical certainty of Japanese defeat had been written clearly in production statistics available before Pearl Harbor. Japanese strategic planners had access to those numbers, discussed them in planning sessions, understood them intellectually. They simply chose not to believe the implications until overwhelming evidence made denial impossible. In that fatal choice lay the complete destruction of Imperial Japan, the deaths of millions, and history's most expensive lesson about the fundamental relationship between industrial power and military outcomes in modern warfare.